Hey everybody, welcome back to Men Need to Be Heard. My name is Dan, and this show is about educating people on various issues that men and boys face, but sometimes the issues that we're talking about don't just affect men and boys, they affect everyone. And one of the biggest topics that I'm often asked about and asked to speak about by my followers is parental alienation. It's something that I lived through as a child, and I also lived through as a parent of children. And it's a topic that a lot of people don't really understand. And they have a lot of misconceptions about what it is. So I wanted to reach out and get someone that I consider an expert on it, although she'll tell you she's not, but she is, and really get her feedback on it and her input, because she has started a new program, a new project, and we'll get into all that. Let me bring her on, because enough about me talking. Let me introduce my friend Madi of the Anti-Alienation Project. Madi, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I've been really excited for this conversation, and I'm really honored that I think I'm an expert on this, maybe from the lived perspective.
I didn't want to put any pressure on you with that, but having watched your videos for some time now, and I did make you aware of this before, but you started doing your videos a few months back, and when you did, within about a week, I started getting, it was well over a dozen, I think, people that follow me said, you got to go check this out. And actually, that
Wow.
continues to this day. I don't know if
Wow.
this happens with you, but I get DMs every day. I mean, I get hundreds of them a day, but sometimes my followers will send me videos. I don't think there's been a week that's gone by since you started that I haven't had at least one person send me one of your videos and say, hey, go check this out. And I'm like, yeah, I've already talked with her many times.
That
But
blows my mind. I don't know how to I don't know how to understand that.
and
It
that's
blows my
why
mind.
the reason is, Maddie, is you're resonating with people. You're telling a story, and we're going to get into all of that, that really does resonate with people, and I think is making them think and go, gee, maybe I'm a victim of parental alienation, or I'm living with it. And that's why I wanted to have you on, because I know, and I'm not pressuring you, but I do consider you to be an expert and well spoken about it. So, before we jump into all that, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, who you are, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. So my name is Maddie. I'm a wife and mother of two little girls. I live in Salt Lake City, Utah. We moved here about a year ago, but I was born and raised in North Carolina. Um, for the purposes of this podcast, though, the most important thing to know is probably that I was, um, I went through parental alienation for 20 years as a child, teenager, young adult, starting at the age of 9, and I figured everything out about 2 years ago now. Starting in this last June, so about 6 months ago, I made my first YouTube video and I started the Anti-Alienation Project. I've been speaking out about this form of abuse and on a journey to heal from it and rebuild my relationship with my dad. That's the short. That's the short answer.
That's perfect. There's nothing wrong with it. It's first of all, I want to say I think it's awesome that you're rebuilding your relationship with your dad. It's as a dad who got alienated had his children alienated from him, and more importantly, as a child who was alienated from his father. I did reconnect with him, but there was always that, I'm going to call it damage. I don't know if that's the right word.
Yeah.
And it was hard to overcome a lot of that, and it affected him, but I didn't realize it because I was young and naive at the time. And we'll get into all that. But before we dive into the wheres and whatnots of what we went through, can you kind of give the audience an understanding of how you define parental alienation? Because we all know the legal definition, or most people do. But I don't think, in my opinion, the legal definition really doesn't explain it well. That's for the lawyers and the judges. I want to get your opinion on what you think, as someone who's lived through it and who is speaking out about it. What do you think parental alienation is? And I guess the second part of that is, what are some of the characteristics of it?
Sure. So parental alienation usually occurs during a divorce or a custody dispute. but not always. We have some people in our support group who were alienated from one of their parents while their parents were still married in the same home. But for the most part, it does occur during a divorce or a custody dispute. And at its most basic terms, parental alienation is a form of both child abuse and domestic violence which involves one parent using coercive control to manipulate their child to reject their other loving parent without true justification.
Beautiful explanation of it. It's, if I can just add to it, it's one person, and I want to be very clear at the very start of this, and I know you agree with me. Primarily, it happens where the dads are alienated, but the reality is it goes both ways. And I don't ever want anyone that's listening to this or watching this to think that we don't acknowledge that fact, because it does go both ways. Mothers get alienated from their children, and it's every bit as bad as when it goes the other way. But having lived through it as a child myself, the struggle for me was I had no idea what it was, right? And
Of course.
yeah, you're for me it started. My parents separated when I was about 9 months old, so I have zero recollection of my parents ever being together. And I contend now, of course, I didn't know then, that it started then. And as I have found some things out, I think that's a fair statement to make. But it's what do you think are some of the ways for someone? It's like, well, if was I alienated, or am I alienating, or am I being alienated? What are some of the characteristics that you identify that would help someone understand if maybe they've been going through it or are going through it?
Well, one of the things I was going to speak about initially is the five-factor model that Dr. Burnett has developed. The first thing that you usually notice in parental alienation from the outside perspective is factor one, that the child is manifesting contact refusal or contact resistance, and they're avoiding a relationship with one of the parents. An important factor too to understand too is that before the child begins to display this refusal or resistance, there was a healthy and happy, loving relationship
Mm-hmm.
between the child and the now rejected parent. And that's very true for my case. I was daddy's little girl. He was my best friend. We were really tight for the first 7 or so years of my life. Factor three is the absence of abuse or neglect, although there may be false accusations of abuse and neglect. In reality, there has been no abuse or neglect. Factor four would be the use of multiple alienating behaviors on the part of the alienator. And we can get into those more in a minute. But factor five, the final factor, is that the child exhibits, they found 8 behavioral manifestations of alienation. And if the child ticks off most of those boxes, that would be factor five.
It's, and I would sum it all up as this to the average person that's out there. It's not natural for a child to not want to be with or to not love their parent.
There you
If
go.
you're seeing a child demonstrate those type of behaviors, which all fall, I think, is the above those factors you listed, which are excellent. That's a sign. It doesn't prove it, but that's a sign that maybe we need to look into it, because it is not natural for any child to not want to be with a parent, or to
I'm so glad
resist.
you said that. I'm
Yeah.
so glad you said that. It's researchers have found, social workers have found that even children who have been sexually or physically abused most often do not display such hatred or outright rejection of their parent. In fact, if CPS shows up, most of these kids will be really upset and cling to their abusive parent. So to display hatred and to want a complete cutoff from a parent as a child is very, very abnormal. And in my opinion, that should, if you notice that a child is displaying hatred and just wanting complete cutoff, and you ask the child, what can the parent do? How can they fix things? And their answer is always going to be nothing. They can't do anything, nothing. I believe those instances should always be investigated for potential parental alienation.
Yeah, I often have seen. I've spoken with many people that have been through it. And I've spoken with people that I recognize are alienators. A lot of times they don't recognize they are, to be honest with you. I mean, you're smiling because I think you know that too. Some of them, now in my case, my mother knew exactly what she was doing. It was deliberate, right? But there are cases out there where it's, I don't want to say inadvertent, that's not the right term, but they're alienating their child, but a lot of times they don't realize they're doing it. It's very subtle sometimes, but it has a dramatic effect.
Yes, I think there's a difference. I know there's a scale like mild, severe, pathological,
Hmm.
something along those lines. And I think for mild alienators, there are some parents where if you point out how what they're doing is really damaging their child, they will stop. These alienators can change and stop. There are other alienators who sound like your mom, who they are doing the alienation and they know they're doing it and they're not going to stop. And then there's the third class, which is the most, in a way, the most dangerous class, who are the pathological alienators who truly believe the lies they're telling the child. And that's what I would classify for my parent. They actually believe my dad doesn't love me. They actually believe he can't feel empathy. They actually believe all these terrible things in a way they've made themselves believe their own lies.
That's a good point you made, and I would put my mother in that category as well.
Okay.
It's interesting because there is a spectrum, and people will often say to me, and I want to get your opinion on this. You'll hear, let's say, mom. Again, this is non-gendered, but I'm going to use mom in this case. Mom will say, "Well, I'm worried about the child when they're with dad," and in some cases, there may be a legitimate reason for that, right? She may have been the sole primary class slash sole caregiver or whatever. And now that dynamic's changed a little bit. We're not talking about those. That legitimate concerns like something like that, that's fine. Concerns about abuse, you've already addressed that earlier in when you listed the 5 factors, right? We're not talking about those cases. We're talking about the parents who are engaging in certain behaviors at some level that ultimately are driving the child to not want to be with the parent. And I want to make that clear to people because there is a distinction. Of course, if you have legitimate concerns, they're valid. I don't ever want to minimize them. But to your point you made, especially with the extreme levels, my mother absolutely believed it. There's no question.
Yeah.
Even when I confronted her later and said,
Yeah.
this isn't true, this isn't true, you said this, you said this happened, and I can prove it didn't. Because in my case, where I recognized it was I saw her doing it with my little sister who had a different father. And
Oh.
I was about 12, 13 years old, and I went, wait a minute, right? That's not true. And then I'm like, well, wait, she said the same thing about me and my dad. And then things started going, right? And that's how I figured it out. I didn't know what it
Oh,
was at the time. Yeah.
I don't think I realized that you learned it so
Oh,
young. What
yeah.
was the impact of learning it so young? Do you think it was better for you to have learned it that young,
Ooh,
or
that's a
was it
great
traumatic to
question,
be
Maddie.
stuck? Was it traumatic to be stuck in the home with your alienator?
I ultimately left because of it. So
Wow.
I started confronting her on things when I was about 12, 13, probably 13. I'll go with 13. And it was about 3.5 years later, I ultimately left because I realized the break was there at that point. And
Mhm.
that's when I started engaging with my dad more. He lived about 15 miles away. And the only time I saw him was from noon till 6 on Saturdays.
That's it.
That's it. That's all the time I was granted. And if he showed up at 12:01, I wasn't allowed to go with him because dad didn't want to see you. He's obviously late because he didn't care. Or if I was a minute late coming back, oh, I won't even go into what she would say on that. So there were times that she would use that. He gets stuck in traffic or whatever. And if he showed
Yeah.
up early, she wouldn't let me out the door. So if he were to get there 15 minutes early, he'd be sitting in the driveway for 15 minutes because he tried that. And I'd be going, Dad's here, I'm ready to go. Nope, it's not 12. I mean, that's what I lived with. So, I saw her start doing that with my younger sister.
Oh man.
And to answer your question, because now you got me, I'm thinking as I'm
Mhm.
talking. I think in some ways it was beneficial to learn that early, but I wasn't prepared as I might have been at, say, let's say 23 instead of 13. That said, I don't know if you're ever prepared to deal with it, right?
Right.
But
Right.
it was an interesting, as I look back at it now, it was an interesting time in the sense that once I started figuring things out and started talking with my dad about it, and we can get
Mhm.
into some of his reactions, I saw how much it hurt him. I saw,
Uh,
you know, he was struggling to figure it out too at that point. Ultimately, I ended up moving in with him. So I left my mother and lived with my dad for many years, probably 4 or 5 years, when I started college and all that. So, we rebuilt the relationship, but there was always a gap there. And I can say that to this day.
How would you, can you say more of that? I'm so curious because I'm going through the
You,
process with my dad and I recognize a gap, but I wonder how you would describe it.
ooh, that's a tough one. See, this is why I love these conversations because
Yeah.
I'm sure anyone listening that's lived through it is going, "Oh my God, that's me," or maybe they're
I feel
going,
that.
"I
Yeah.
didn't know that." All right. The way I describe it is the relationship was strong. I knew my dad loved me. I can say that with absolute certainty, and I can say that I knew that all along, even with all the stuff that was going on. As I look back now, during the time, I kind of knew, but it was like, is he? That's what I mean by the gap, right? Is
Mhm.
he says he loves me? Everything I'm seeing shows
Yeah.
me he loves me, but does he? You know,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
what I call the gap. And I will tell you at now 60 years old, mind you, that was 50 years ago.
Right.
I still have that. And it's not
Oh,
just with my dad, it's with
it's with
everyone.
everyone. Yeah, me too.
Everyone.
It's like there's a degree of separation between me and every other person on earth.
Yep. Even when they've never shown any inclination, let alone actually done anything. I'm always waiting for that ball to drop. That's what I mean by
Jeez,
the gap.
so relatable. That is so relatable. That's what almost exactly what I would mean by it too. I think there's a level, if for me it feels more like anxiety, that gap.
Okay.
Um, like like there was this basically what I see that my mom did is she did an extreme version of triangulation on both of us. She made me believe my dad doesn't love me and is abusive so that I treated him and rejected him. I treated him negatively and rejected him for so long that because of that, he came to believe that I didn't love him. So I'm anxious around him, not so much anymore, but uh, used to be extremely anxious. And then he'd be anxious around me because he believed I didn't love him. So for me, it's that gap of wanting to love each other and it's and being and believing and knowing we love each other, but the damage that's been caused is still somewhat there.
And that's why, and I'm sure you've dealt with this too. You'll have people come at you because I've made videos on parental alienation, and inevitably someone will come on and go, "There's no such thing," or "It's not a big deal," and I'm like, "You have no idea." And
Like,
I have
yeah.
been known to call them out on the carpet because I'm a little more blunt than you. But I'm like, you have no idea because it doesn't just affect that relationship, whether it's
Mm,
with your dad or it could be with a mom. And by the way, you can see it with grandparents. It's called parental alienation, but that's a broad term. It happens in my case. My whole dad's side of the family, I was alienated from,
mhm,
and I've reconnected with some of them. But like,
mhm.
if there was a family reunion, they wouldn't invite me, and I don't fault them for it because they don't know who I was. I'm no different than if you went. They don't know me. They didn't interact with me at all. I barely saw most of them. The little bit that I did, if where I would see them was occasionally my mom would be doing something and I would stay over at my dad's. And my uncle lived right behind him. And being Italians, they would get together on Saturday nights and get drunk, basically. And I actually have fond memories of that, but that's really the only interaction I had with that whole side of the family.
Oh, okay.
My grandmother, my dad's mom, died when I was 10 years old. I didn't go to the funeral. I have very, very few memories of her at all. In fact, I remember her dog more than I remember her.
Oh, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
and that's why I say to people, you can't fathom the effect that it
No.
has on someone unless you've been through it or seen it from either the parent or the child side. What would you say? You have similar things with that?
Oh, 100%. I could talk about this for over an hour. People think that it affects a child, but no, it affects a person.
Hmm.
It doesn't just steal a childhood, it can steal a lifetime. A lot of people never figure out that they're alienated, and it doesn't just affect the relationship with the targeted parent, like you said, or your relationships with other romantic partners down the line, because it causes attachment issues, but it affects the way you view yourself. I mean, the everyone in our support group that I've talked to is rock bottom self-esteem, even if I mean, they've maybe have gotten better, but that is a huge factor. And what happens is because you're taught that you're one of your parents either, doesn't care about you, doesn't love you, um, you're taught to hate them and reject them. So as a kid, you internalize that. And you don't know that you're internalizing that. But for me, I always had the thought of if my own parent who created me doesn't love me, like what good am I? And
Exactly.
so I think that is a big thing that causes these predictable, very predictable effects on the child, which tend to be self-destructive. So if you think of self-harm, eating disorders, drug addiction, alcoholism, suicidal ideation, suicidal attempts, um, also perfectionism, other mental health issues, physical health issues. Because most alienated children, I've talked to experts about this, I've talked to therapists about this, they all concur that most alienated children are probably suffering from complex PTSD, which is a form of PTSD that happens when you're living day in and day out in an abusive situation that you can't escape, basically. And so it affects your view of yourself, your view of the world, so many things that will extend into adulthood a lot of the time.
Oh, absolutely, it does. I mean, we've kind of already talked about that. It affects me to this day, 50 odd years later. You're a little newer to the. I think you said it was about 2 years ago you started figuring it out. But if you hear, and for someone listening, you hear, even though mine was 50 years ago and hers was only a couple, we're saying the same things. The same feelings are coming out. The same thought processes are coming out. I don't want to say it's universal because we're all different. We all react to different things. But what you're hearing from both of us is really how the majority of those who have gone through an alienation situation feel. And I've talked with hundreds of people. I know you have, and you have your groups and all that. A question I have for you is you learned in your late 20s, you kind of figured it out. What
Mhm.
was it like for you? Because again, my experience is different. I figured it out earlier.
Sure.
What was it like for you as a teenager, maybe, or early in your college years? How was that? Because I personally can't relate to that. I had already figured it out and reconciled with my father. In fact, when I went to college, I lived with him. So I was just curious because I think the audience would benefit from something like that.
Okay. You mean what was my
How are you
experience?
feeling? What was the experiences? That type of thing.
Okay. I think, oh, overall, it was a very difficult time. I really struggled. And for people who are familiar with my story, I might be repeating myself here, but I am the oldest of five children. I have four younger brothers, and my brothers were never alienated from my dad. It was just me. I was specifically targeted as the only girl and the oldest child. So my brothers have always had really close, happy, loving relationships with my dad. And mine has been a struggle, to put it lightly, since I was 9 years old when they got divorced. So for me, it was growing up with a lot of pushback from my brothers about why I was treating my dad a certain way, why I was not going with him. And then I couldn't understand why my brothers were going with him
Hmm.
if he was this abusive, selfish man. And now, something that has stuck with me is someone asked me a question the other day. They asked me, don't you think it's odd that if your mom maintained that your dad was such an evil character, an abusive guy with narcissistic personality disorder, so unloving, isn't it odd that she would willingly let your brothers go with him all the time?
Yeah, I mean, but you're young at this point, right? You were 9, 10, 11 years old. So you're not really able to understand it. But now that you look back on it, how did I'm curious what your thought process is on that now.
Well, I can tell you what she would tell me when I brought that up.
Okay.
When I said to her, Mom, why are the boys going with dad? You know, she would tell me, and I'm a little embarrassed now to have fallen for this, but she would tell me that, Maddie, well, you're just so much more perceptive than the boys. The boys worship your dad and put him on a pedestal, but you're a critical thinker. You're more perceptive than them. You see things that they don't.
Wow. So she
So
was,
kind of stroking my
yeah, I
ego.
was going to say she was playing to your ego, is the exact term I was going to use.
Yeah.
That's, that I'm going to put it this way, that's evil genius. I mean,
Well,
seriously.
and so when I learned the truth, honestly, it was really confusing because I learned that 95% of alienators have a personality disorder.
Hmm.
And it had always been so solidified in my mind that my dad has narcissistic personality disorder. So to learn that my mom might have a personality disorder really tripped me up for months. And then I realized, what if she was just projecting that all along? But that's one of the characteristics of if a child is going through a different form of abuse, or if they're going through parental alienation, is I think the use of terminology that's above their age, and usually psychological terminology. And like a 9-year-old wouldn't really know what narcissistic personality disorder is unless their parent has told them.
Right, exactly. You know, it's, and I've heard the same from other experts, psychologists myself, is that the patterns that you see, and a key point you just made is sometimes these same patterns can occur when it's not parental alienation, right? You see it with other forms of abuse, which can make it, I've had psychologists tell me that can make it difficult to understand or diagnose that it's parental alienation. And it's
Sure.
one of the reasons why the courts struggle with it sometimes because they're judges, right? they're not trained in it. They have a little bit of training here and there. And that's where I think even the average layman cannot really grasp it fully because when an alienator is operating, and my mother was an evil genius also, I say that because she was able to manipulate me in ways somewhat similar to yours, but not quite the same, but manipulate me in ways to think that, everything that my dad was doing was in actuality, and as I realized later, it was her. My mother was bipolar, had a few other issues, but she would say your dad is right now. To your point, 8, 9, 10 years old, I wouldn't know what bipolar was, but she would use she would say your dad has problems, And then the other thing I would hear often is she wasn't just saying it to me, she was telling everyone around us this was going
Yeah.
on. And I would hear it. Back in the day there
Yeah.
weren't cell phones, right? So our phone was in our kitchen and my bedroom was right off our kitchen. So she would be talking to a friend or whomever and I would overhear those things. As I look back now and having found out what I found out, I can safely say she was projecting onto my father much of what was actually her experience. And
Yeah.
it's it's something I hear often from people who recognize they were alienated later in life.
There's one other thing that comes to mind for me when you're talking about that is something that I haven't really heard many people talk about, but is true in my case. A lot of it is generational. And here's what happened to my mom. My mom also went through a traumatic childhood, and her mom, my grandma, alienated my mom from her dad. And And my mom went years without talking to her dad at certain points. So I think it became normalized for her. But on top of that, my mom always believed that her brothers were more important to her dad than she was. So what my mom told me the whole time is that, my dad, he took an interest in me until my brothers could throw a baseball and go fishing and hunting with him. And then my dad stopped caring about me and didn't want to spend time with me anymore. And that he loves my brothers more than me, which is now I can realize I believed it, hook, line, and sinker the whole time. But now I can realize that that was just her projecting her own experience with her own younger brothers onto me.
Makes total sense, and I can relate to that somewhat. My mother was alienated from her father. Unfortunately, my grandfather, my mother's father, served in World War II and went through a devastating experience in that, as I came to find out later. And to be honest with you, it was PTSD, but he was not safe to be around. So it wasn't true alienation, but some of the same patterns were going on. And I do think it can be generational in full, or in my case, partially, right?
Mm.
There was legitimate reasons for my grandmother to be concerned about my mother spending time with her father.
Mhm.
That said, severing the relationship completely was not an answer either.
Mm.
It's a struggle in that situation. And that's why I always say to people, if there's a legitimate concern, we don't want to discount that. But I rarely can justify ever completely severing a relationship between a parent and a child. There may be, of course, instances, severe, say, sexual abuse or something like that, of course. But most of the time, even if there's been physical abuse, they can still talk on the phone because it. People say, well, that's not good for the child. I will tell you, having spoken with children that went through that, they still would benefit from it, right? They may not be able to physically be alone with them, but they struggle with some of the same things that you and I do, even though it wasn't alienation in that case. It's so interesting to see how these dynamics all kind of interplay, right? And the struggles that have. A question for you now is, if you don't mind sharing, and of course, if there's nothing if you're not comfortable sharing anything, please just say so. But how is your relationship with your brothers now? Because that had to have been strained while you were going through it.
While I was alienated?
Yeah, I mean, they had to be going. Why aren't you going? Right.
Yeah. Yeah. It was, you know, information is power, knowledge is power, and my mom definitely knows that. So she would do all the bad mouthing and just, I don't know what to call it. People call it a campaign of denigration, but in my experience, it was the closest I came to feeling like she was excited and happy to spend time with me was when she was talking bad about my dad or, that kind of thing. Um, so there was so much that happened when my brothers would go with my dad every other weekend and every Wednesday night. Um, that would be her time to shine with all the um, allegations and hatred and, talking about my stepmom, my step siblings, just whatever she wanted. And my brothers never knew any of that. I was completely controlled by my mom, isolated by her. And my dad, or my brothers always had a level of protection against my mom because of their close relationships with my dad. So if my mom were to do something to my brothers, they would tell my dad, and she knew that. If my mom did something to me, I would tell no one, and she knew
Mm-hmm.
that. So it was more than one type of abuse going on with me and her. And, you know, it's my brothers do not understand. I do not think they understand. I now it's weird because yeah, I dealt with the pushback from them about how I would not go with my dad, how I would treat my dad for 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm dealing with the pushback of why aren't you talking to mom? Why aren't you having a relationship with mom? And they don't,
They
I
can't
think
relate
it's
to it.
too much. oh, of course they cannot relate. I
Right.
had a conversation with one of my brothers and told him about how how mom made me believe dad didn't love me, and he said, "I just don't understand, Maddie, because I've always known that mom and dad love me."
And it's, again, it points to the effects. It's not just that child or the parent doing the alienating or the alienated parent that suffer. It's the whole family, right?
Yeah, we're still, I mean, the relate like I love my brothers so much, and specifically one of my brothers growing up, I would say he was triangulated, not alienated.
Hmm.
But he was the only other child who had some hurdles with the relationship with my dad. And he was, I would say, triangulated. Like
Can
he
I just
still,
interrupt you? Can you explain what triangulation is, just for someone that might not know what it is?
so triangulation is basically when one person tries to get in between a relationship of two other separate people and turn them against each other,
Right.
essentially. So, and I've spoken with some therapists. It seems like they have found there's a difference. There are two types of alienated children. Have you heard about this, Dan?
Little bit, little bit.
That there's the first type of alienated children, that's the enmeshed alienated child,
Yeah.
where their alienator needs or wants them to be just like them and almost like their best friend.
Hmm.
Uh, they're completely enmeshed. They're forced to take the alienator's side with every decision, every um, aspect of their lives, and they actively refuse their targeted parent. If you put them in therapy with their targeted parent, they will usually just sit there with their arms crossed like I did, and no progress will be made, essentially. And then you have the triangulated child who the alienator isn't so consumed with possessing and controlling. They're more, this child is more able to be fully present with mom and have a relationship with mom when he's with mom, and then be fully present with dad, have a relationship with dad when they're with dad. But they are still being pit against the other parent, but they manage to keep somewhat of a relationship. And if you put that child in therapy with the targeted parent, what I've been told is that child will usually be able to make progress pretty fast.
Right. And again, I can speak to a little bit on that, but I was not triangulated, nor was my sister, but my daughter was. Right.
Oh,
So I had one daughter, and I'm not going to give too many details about it because she wouldn't be comfortable with it. But in general, it was exactly the scenario you talked about. Is she was alienated from me. There was a period of about 18 months. Her brothers and sisters would come to the house every weekend. She wouldn't. And ultimately, I was fighting in court to make sure that I got to see her, and ultimately, I was successful with that. And I always relay the story, and she's even said this. That first time I picked her up, we actually made a point that I was just going to pick her up. This was what was advised: leave the her brothers and sisters home. She come over to the house, and I was married to my second wife at that time, and she I remember. I'll never forget this. I was sitting in the chair in the living room. She came in the house. She's very uncomfortable. Even I'm like, how do we do this, right? Type thing. Within about 5 minutes of getting in the house, I sat down in my chair in the living room. She came over to the chair, sat down next to me, and did not move for about 3 hours. Just held on to me.
oh
And
man.
that's, yeah, yeah. But having said that, she was still having to deal with triangulation because her mom was still saying things and all that, but she started rebuilding that relationship. But it's been touch and go ever since, right? So I can relate to it from that perspective. There are different types, and someone listening to this, the best advice I would give you is, if you're not sure, is you need to speak to an expert, because I potentially a psychotherapist or something, and even a lot of them don't understand it. But
Mhm.
if the one takeaway, as we continue going through this, is if you suspect it and you see signs in your own life that like I struggle with relationships or whatever, get help. Because the worst
Yeah.
thing you can do is not. But I don't want to take away from our topic too much. So you've now reconciled with your dad. I want to just kind of finish up with your story, because I want to get into the work you're doing after that.
Okay.
But You spent time with your dad. Things are good now, I think it's safe to say. Um,
Yeah, yeah, I mean, we talk almost every day.
that's awesome.
Uh, I know we've gotten to be really close pretty fast. We had that foundation too when I was a kid.
Hmm.
It's just been one of the most pleasant surprises I think I'll ever have in my life. Like having a relationship with my dad was never something I hoped for because I so strongly believed that he didn't love me. So when I figured everything out and I actually told him all the lies I still at the time somewhat believed about him, and learned it was all fake, and he said he was like, we were at the park. I've told this story before on my channel, but we were at the park working out because I had been discovering things and I wanted to collect evidence for if I was on the right track and stuff like that. And he said, I told him, like, I've always believed you didn't love me. And he said, what? Like, the boys know I love them? And he was shocked.
Hmm.
Basically, all the things I was made to believe and everything that went on behind closed doors to when he figured it out, it was so much worse than he could have ever imagined. That's what he said. He said he had never in his wildest dreams imagined that the things I was being made to believe and think were going on. He said that he would have called the police if he had known, but not to scare any parents listening out there. That's not my intention. It's just to show there's such a disconnect. I think I see that when a lot of parents message me too, is they don't know what's going on behind closed doors. But for a child to go from having a healthy, happy relationship with their parent to being hateful, angry, anxious, completely rejecting them, uh, you better believe they're being told some pretty vicious, heinous lies.
Yeah, and it's again, it kind of your story resonates with me, and I'm sure many others because that's kind of how my father was too, right? As it was really difficult at first for us. Even when I moved in with him, it was really difficult because we didn't really know each other. That's the other thing I always tell people is even though I saw him not every week, but most weekends for that 6 hour period, we didn't really know each other. And some of that is directly related to the time spent. How do you know someone if you're only spending 6 hours a week with them, right? As a parent. But a lot of it was he never knew either. He knew there was conflict, but my mother was masterful at what she was doing. And I never
I
certainly told him anything, right?
I
So
know.
my father had similar experiences to your dad, which was, oh my God, I never knew. Now this was in the '70s. If my father had called the police or tried to go to court, they would have laughed at him. Nothing would have been done. It's different now. They will take a little bit more action. But it's one thing I would say to people because I talk with guys going through divorce that are facing some of this pretty much every day. It's a struggle, and to the point that Maddie made is if you suspect it, trust your gut. It doesn't mean you're
Yes.
right 100% of the time. You may be wrong, but trust your gut and start looking into it because
Yes.
you need to do it for yourself, but just as importantly for the child, because as we've talked about, it affects them for the rest of their life. But I'm a big believer in trusting your gut. If you're seeing something, that's usually a sign, or feeling something that something's going on.
Yes. And another thing is I recently learned is that it takes about 30 days for the child to be under the manipulation and the pressure for them to finally give up hope and let the alienation solidify. So if you have the opportunity to, see your child more often in shorter increments, that's better to avoid the alienation from solidifying.
Hmm.
And that is so relatable to me because my mom got that bogus restraining order, and that's when the alienation was solidified for me in those 30 days.
Wow. See, now that's new to me. I haven't heard it was as quick as 30 days.
That's what I've been
Wow.
told.
So, again, I can't relate to it because I was literally a baby, right? So when it started for me, so I can't relate to it, but I could see the validity in that, right? It's
Ah,
especially with a younger child, 7, 8, 9 years old. They have no experience in the world. They don't know. They're going to believe naturally what their mommy or daddy is telling them.
Exactly. They don't know what manipulation is. And add to the point where if you have a pathological alienator who is not lying in their own head, they're telling the child the truth.
Mhm.
So, how is the child supposed to detect a lie when the person telling the lie doesn't even know they're lying?
Right. They believe it so sincerely themselves. If they were to take a
Yeah.
lie detector, they would pass it because they
Yeah.
genuinely believe it. And so all the visual or emotional cues you might get that might give you some doubt aren't there.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's I could tell you for certain that's what I experienced, right?
Mhm.
My mother was a highly intelligent woman also. So
Yeah.
she in my case, and I'm not trying to, get sympathy for me or make light of anything for anybody else, but my mother was a master at what she was doing. And in her case, she knew exactly what she was doing. There's no question of it. But and
Yeah.
that's
I
why I
did.
say she's evil. And what was interesting too was as I got older and saw when she started to do it with my sister. Now, she was like I said, I was a baby when my mom and dad split. My sister split from her father at about 5.5 years old, almost 6. So at that time, I'm 6 years older than her. I was 12 going into 13. And so I can look back now and say it happened immediately that the behavior my mother was doing. Oh, your
Wow.
father's horrible, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I did not get along with him, but that was my own, right? My mother did not affect that. I didn't like him before all that happened, right? But I remember, and this might be a point that you've heard before too. I remember my sister coming to me later after I moved out. Why did you move out? Where did you go? Right? And I didn't want to tell her what I had learned. I had no idea. I was 16, 17 years old. I had no idea how to help her.
Yeah.
I couldn't even begin to understand it for myself, let alone her. I knew what it was. I knew what was happening to her, but to fix it, no idea. Interesting part was later on when she turned about 17, 18. She was had drug issues, drinking, all those issues. School, tried to drop out, never went to college, all that stuff. She came to me shortly after that period and said, "Can I ask you some questions?" And
Wow.
point blank asked me, "Did my dad not want to see me? Did my dad blah blah blah?" Right? And I knew the truth.
Yeah.
And to her benefit, she had me to explain it to her, which most people don't. Right?
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow. That's amazing that she had
she
you. Did
had
you
me.
tell her the truth?
I said to her, all right, we're gonna have a chat, right? We're gonna sit down and have a chat. So I had said, come on over, and
Yeah.
I told my then wife, leave, take the kids, get out. I'm just gonna talk with my sister, and we talked. God, Maddie, probably 4 hours. And I said, here's what I saw. I can't say I wasn't judgmental, but I was doing everything I could not to be. Here's the
Right.
facts.
Yeah.
And she brought up certain situations, and I said, well, that's not really what it was, or no, there's some truth to it, but here's what I saw. Right. Long story
Mhm.
short, she ended up disowning my mother also, and
I'm not
reconciled with
surprised.
her dad, and actually had an unbelievably close relationship after that.
That's
It you know,
awesome.
and it was funny because she would say, "Why don't you come over and spend time with me and my dad?" Him and I just oil and water, right? But I actually had a conversation with him afterward, and I'm like, "Look, you and I don't get along. We all know that." I was like 30 at the time, but I understand what you went through, and I get it. And and I can't say he was never abusive to me or anything. We just didn't get along, so we weren't going to go out and have a beer together, type thing. But my sister benefited from that. That said, even now, and she's 55, still struggles with it all.
It's a life sentence. It is.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. It's a life sentence I wouldn't wish on anyone. So I'm grateful when my brothers can't understand it. I'm glad that I was the only one alienated, but your sister's really lucky to have you. I had a very, very similar conversation too, where I reached out to all the family members I knew I could trust. And I flat out said, like, you need to tell me the truth. You need to tell me. And they did, because my dad was very reluctant to tell me anything.
And there's an interesting point too. That's a very common thing, right? The
Yeah,
targeted parent, I guess, to their credit, tries not
yeah.
to do the same behavior because they know the result of it and they know what happens when you are targeted. And
They yeah.
I've had others say to me, "Why doesn't my dad or my mom fight back?" Right, in the sense that why don't they never badmouth the other parent? I can't tell you countless times I've had people say my dad has never once badmouthed my mother, even after
Mhm.
she did everything. My position on it is they know what it feels like, or it may be subconscious, but they know, and I think that's the large reason. What do you think about that?
Well, yes, I agree. I think that's one reason. I think another reason is that the difference between the targeted parent usually and the alienator parent is that the alienator has little to no regard for the best interest of the child. And they're just thinking about themselves. And so it doesn't cross their mind that it might hurt the child to do these things. Whereas the targeted parent actually does have the best interest of the child at heart. And they know that it's best for that child to have relationships with both parents. So naturally, I'm a parent too. And I can never imagine as even if my husband did something, terrible, I can never imagine telling my child, your dad doesn't love you. And that's the difference between having your child's best interest at heart and not thinking of them or not caring about the damage it's going to do to them.
Oh, I couldn't agree more with you on that. It's you know I have never badmouthed my children's mother ever. And it's funny because I would have to go to court frequently. I mean, I was in family court. I always say this every month for about 12 years. I mean, literally, try fighting to be with the kids. And my kids that are older now, and they're like, "Wait a minute, I remember you going to court," and our mom saying you were going to court, and she would badmouth me and all that stuff. But now at the time they're like they didn't get it, but now they're like, "You were fighting for us." Yeah, I was, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I've gone out of, even though I have feelings towards my X1, I call her. X2 was fantastic. But you'll never hear me say a bad word about X2. But X1, even to this day, I won't badmouth her. Now, my kids have come to me and asked me questions, and I think
Okay.
this is what your dad goes through. Is I'm like, I don't want to answer, you know,
Mhm.
and I'll try and couch it in a way that's not negative, but I don't want to lie to my kids. I will never lie to my kids.
Yeah.
My oldest daughter has come to me recently with a couple of things, and it was just kind of funny. I don't even think she realized she was doing it. It was kind of just a casual conversation. She brought something up, and I'm like, "Oh, if I could tell you the real story, but I chose not to because I wanted to protect her. She's 35 years old, but I'm still trying to protect her because it's not in her best interest to hear that. There's no benefit to anyone to do that, and that is what separates the alienator from the person that gets targeted. I think
Mhm.
almost universally, and at least from my experience. I'm sure others would disagree with that. What would you think?
About what specifically?
Like, do you see that targeted parents generally react the same way, where they try not to in any way negatively disparage the alienating parent?
From the people I've talked to, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The targeted parent is usually, almost always, the healthier parent.
And that's the scary part when it comes to the courts, right? The court,
Yeah.
and I know you're not an expert on it, and I don't profess to be, but having dealt with it and having worked with guys that are dealing with it in family court, having spoken to God knows how many lawyers and psychologists related to courts, the courts really struggle with this also because they can't, they're human beings, right? And if a judge is sitting on the bench, and just to set the scenario for someone that has never been to family court, if you go into family court on a custody issue or an issue of like the one parent's blocking access or something like that, you're talking with a man or woman sitting on a bench. They've read the briefs, right? Maybe 10 minutes beforehand. right? They get
Hmm.
they get a couple of page summary. They read that. They go in, and if you're lucky, you might get 15 minutes to present your case. In most cases, there are exceptions. I mean, there's times I was in there for 5 hours, but the majority of the time, you got about 10, 15 minutes to present your case. And of course, they're going to hear the other side. So this
Hmm.
poor, I people hate me because I defend judges, but this poor person is sitting on the bench and having to figure out, is this alienation or not, in about 15, 20-minute period. And they
I
really,
know.
and they struggle with it.
Yeah, so you mentioned the question, like, how do you differentiate between a parent who may be an alienator uh, versus a parent who is in versus having legitimate concerns for their children and their other parent. And my first response was just, can we screen everybody for a personality disorder? Because, 95% of these people have personality disorders. But then I thought about it more and more, and I realized that this is the hardest question to answer. And the alienator parent can be so covert, convincing, charming, sweet, selfless, appearing to be selfless. I would say it can be next to impossible for a judge to determine if you're working with such an intelligent and charming, convincing alienator. I think might be more uh, effective to focus on the relationship with the child and the alienator versus just focusing on the alienator or just focusing on the child. I mean, if you're going to focus on the alienator at all, I think it would be more effective to analyze the relationship that they have with the child. And you would notice some things, I think, maybe parentification, enmeshment. You would notice some dynamics, I think, that might be signs of to tip people off. But I mean, if you put this targeted parent in the position where they're losing their child who's
Right.
still alive, of course they're going to be reactive and anxious and terrified. And that's usually how they come across in court. They come across as unstable. And so that just solidifies in the judge's mind that this targeted parent is somewhat unstable, whereas the alienator can be very, very smooth and charming and seeming to have so much love for their child. So it's a tricky, tricky question to answer.
Yeah, it's, as I had one lawyer tell me that it's even tough for the lawyers representing the alienators because it seems so genuine their concern, right? And then, like, one lawyer told me, as he looks back, he realized it was an alienation situation, but when they were in court, he got the father, who was the targeted parent, to basically lose it, get angry,
Oh,
and understandably so, right? You've lost access to your child. You want to be with your child, and this lawyer manipulated through his questioning, got the guy to blow up, which then convinced the judge, right? And then he looks back at it and he says, "Well, it was the worst mistake of my life." But I didn't know, right? I believed everything I was told. And again, I'm not one. I don't want to defend judges, but this is the reality people need to understand. That's why I want to bring it up and understand also that psychologists struggle with this, and they have had actual training. Judges haven't, right? Psychologists go to college for years, and they
yeah.
still struggle to figure it out. It's Many of them have told me that even now, even though they have experience with it, they're always wondering, am I making the right call, so to speak?
Right. And Dan, I don't know if you know this, but I've spoken with several therapists, psychologists who work with alienated children and their families. They're not allowed to tell the child what's happening or the parents that they're alienating the child. They're not allowed to say the term parental alienation.
No, I know, I knew that. Yeah, they're not.
Like,
eh,
what other kind of abuse can you allow to continue without telling the parents or the child, listen, this is not okay?
And I think the thought process on that is you don't want to make it worse, but in my mind, in some ways, again, it depends on the child, their maturity level, their age, and all that. If I'm not trying to defend them, but if it was a 7, 8 year old, I could make the argument you don't want to use the term parental alienation, let's say. Doesn't mean you can't talk about it indirectly. If it's a
Mm.
15, 16-year old, yeah, I think you can have that conversation. But there are 16-year-olds that aren't as mature as 7-year-olds. Let's be honest, right? So the point I want to make, and feel free to weigh in on, is it's such a tricky dynamic that there is no one size fits all answer to it for anyone.
I agree with that. I think that something important for people to understand is that psychological abuse is just as damaging as other types of abuse. So I think that the fact that it is psychological allows tons of people, from social workers, therapists, even parents, to kind of enable it in certain ways where you wouldn't do that with someone who's being molested.
I have always argued, and I catch flack for this sometimes, that people will often say, "Well, physical abuse is worse." No, it's not.
No.
Emotional, psychological, bruises heal on the outside, bruises on the inside don't. That's my
And
viewpoint, and I catch hell for
yeah,
it sometimes, but I've dealt with both.
yeah.
And we've talked about it. Me at 60 years old, still dealing with what happened to me at 8, 9, 10 years old, and the effects it has.
Right. And you know that hitting people, hopefully you're taught at some point in your life that hitting people is wrong and that rape is wrong. But no one teaches anyone that this parental alienation is wrong or even to look out for it. They don't even want to use the term. So there's a high chance that kids who are alienated into adulthood will never figure it out.
Yeah, it's like we can't even have the conversation, right? Which is why I
Yeah.
have you here, so that we can have that conversation.
Which is the reason why I'm doing my project, essentially.
And this is why I created this segue. That is how I did this. I mean, and that's where I want to go next, Maddie, if we may.
Yeah.
I want to kind of shift the focus in the discussion to the work you're doing. So, about 6 months or so ago, you started the Anti-Alienation Project. I can never say that fast. Sorry. Can you first of all tell us what it is? What is the Anti-Alienation? See, I can't say it. Alienation Project. Let me fix my teeth. Go ahead.
You just say the AAP.
There we go. Okay.
Would you like to know how I began
Sure.
it
All
or?
whatever you want to share on it. Go ahead.
Okay, so I figured out the truth in 2022. I remember the moment very clearly. I was sitting in the attic for some reason and I was doing a Google search. And a video by Ryan Thomas, who's a former alienated child, popped up on my screen. And I watched his video called Parental Alienation Explained by a Former Alienated Child. And I had my light bulb moment. And for most people I've talked to, it seems to be that way. Like you learn about it and you have a light bulb moment. Like you just know that's what's happened to you. So he was explaining his own experience, but it was like my life was coming out of his mouth. It was just the wildest thing, and I knew that this has happened to me. So I learned the truth. It was really traumatic for me. I never questioned my mom's beliefs and lies. I never questioned any of this ever for 20 years, which might be hard to believe, but that's the truth. And so, what happened over the next few weeks is I had panic attacks and anxiety attacks throughout the day, every day. It was bad. And I remember more than anything this intense feeling of being alone, incredibly alone. Like no one could understand what I had lived through, and no one could understand the intimacy of the betrayal. Not my siblings, because they weren't alienated, not my friends, not my therapist, and not even my dad, because he wasn't there. And the isolation that I felt as I was trying to figure things out and get better in therapy, and as I was trying to rebuild my relationship with my dad, the isolation and the feeling of not being understood only compounded as I did more and more research. For example, to hear that major organizations like the United Nations and the World Health Organization were denying the abuse I've lived through was like a new experience of being gaslit
Mm-hmm.
by society. And I was surprised. I kept looking for people that were speaking out from the child's point of view online. Um, and I really couldn't find many people. I found Amanda Sillers, but she's in Australia and she doesn't really make videos so much. I found Ryan Thomas, but at that point he wasn't producing many new videos. And Um, I was surprised that not many people were speaking out, although I could understand why. I also immediately began to notice changes as a natural result of finally figuring out what it is that I needed to heal from and figuring out the truth. So, like almost immediately, it just happened as a natural process. I began to improve every aspect of my life, from my physical health to my relationships, my friendships, my marriage, uh, the way I was able to just take motherhood by the reins, and it just everything improved. Um, I began to feel more periods of happiness and peace and excitement and joy, and let myself experience those things. Um, but most of all, the desire to post a YouTube video came from one, isolation, feeling that lack of support. I wanted to meet other people who had been through this. And then also, as I started to improve so much, so quickly with my health, mental health, etc., I started to think, oh my God, there must be millions of other alienated people out there who, if they could learn the truth too, maybe they could really improve their lives and create a wonderful life for themselves too. And so my mission has always been to wake up it's threefold. Wake up other alienated kids to the truth. And when I say kids, I mean really adult
Hmm.
children of alienation. Two, provide support for alienated kids, because as I was figuring things out, I tried to find a support group. I couldn't even find one in the United States, so I created one. I thankfully had a therapist who knew what it was, and still see that awesome therapist. But beyond that, there's not much support for us. So it was to wake up alienated kids to the truth, provide alienated kids with the much needed support that they need, and then expose the long lasting havoc that parental alienation really wreaks on children. It kind of like what we were speaking about at the beginning, that not many people know the damage it causes to a person or a lifetime.
To a family in general, like we talked about. It's,
Yes.
and I applaud you for doing that. It's, it's probably something I should have done 20 years ago. So credit to you for doing that. I've tended to put my focus in other areas, but parental alienation has always been behind the scenes and motivating me to do some of the things I do, because of what I went through, and my goals are very similar to yours, and it's a terrific organization. I want to give credit to you in the sense that took a lot of bravery on your part, because a lot of us that are survivors don't speak out. I speak out, you speak out, and I understand. I don't put anyone down for not speaking out. I totally understand it, right? It's a traumatic thing to deal with. But the
Yeah.
more of us that can speak out and share our stories, and this is where I want to ask you, I know I get constant feedback from people when I've talked about parental alienation and what I went through. The next day, if I post a video, the next day I have literally hundreds of DMs from people that, oh my God, I'm dealing with that, or I went through that and all that. What's
Yeah.
been the experience as you've talked about? Because your videos are amazing.
Thanks.
And the reason I say that is you're educating, but you're sharing stories. Like, you've had other people on and shared their stories, and it resonates when you do that. What's been the experience, both, or excuse me, the response, not just from people in general, but do people that are opening up find the same thing that you did, that it's a healing for them?
Oh, yeah. So to say first, the response overall has been so supportive, so encouraging. Um, it's just been really humbling to know how many people are struggling with this, and how many people have reached out to me and sent emails is overwhelming. Really is. But I wanted to separate the YouTube videos I make with everything else the Anti-Alienation Project is doing. And I've said from the start that all of us adult children who've been through this, affected by divorce or parental alienation, we really need to band together. particularly people who've been through severe alienation, because it is a really difficult time to be in this position, given that a lot of groups in society, think that that it's pseudoscience. So what I started to do is I started to connect with other people who've been through this as former alienated children. So all the things that we want to do with the Anti-Alienation Project, we now have like a leadership team made up of all former alienated children. And I've actually become pretty good friends with these people. Um, so to be able to talk to people in our support group Zoom meetings, to be able to have phone calls with people, and to realize that we've had the same very specific effects play out in our lives due to this, it's just been not only validating, but it's also gives me the momentum to continue. I'm not sure I would be doing this if I hadn't formed this support group and this leadership team that we always have each other's backs. So what we're really working on now is to do these blitz media campaigns on college campuses throughout the US. And we performed our first, I don't know if performed is the right word. We completed our first college campaign at the University of Utah in early November. We had a professional videographer videotape and edit the whole thing. That'll be released with our website January 25th. And our website will be the Anti-Alienation Project.com. But it was a really, really eye-opening experience. One of my friends who's in our leadership team flew in from California to help me do it in the University of Utah. And she was saying beforehand that she was a little worried about having people get mad at us or fight us, that it wasn't real. And I remember I told her, I don't know if that's going to happen. I think most of that is just happening online. And so how it ended up playing out is that we spoke to over 50 students, and not one of them even knew the term parental alienation.
Hmm.
No, zero awareness. So it turns out we didn't have to worry about having those debates at all because there's not even any awareness of the term. However, we would ask them if they knew about it and they would say no, but upon explaining the definitions of parental alienation, what it is, about 10 of those students said something to the effect of, "Oh, so that's what happened to me."
Wow.
So 10 out of
10 out of
50.
50,
And
that's 20%. That's a shocking amount to me. If
oh
I'm
yeah,
being,
and
yeah.
we were able to, and not everybody wanted to be interviewed, but we were able to interview some people who had been through it, and they said, I hadn't heard the term until today, but this has affected me since I was a child.
That
And it's very important to know the term.
and again, that's the goal of having my podcast. I know you do your videos. Is I agree with you completely. And most people don't know that they've experienced it in many cases as young adults, right? College age kids or young adults, and so when they come to that realization, I'm curious, like they respond, like you said, you videoed them and all that, but have you kept in contact with them a few days or weeks later? What has happened with them? I'm curious because when you have that awakening, as you know and I know, it's devastating, right? It's like, whoa, right? You're struggling with things and thoughts and ideas and feelings you never could have imagined. Are you seeing the same thing happening to them?
Right. Yeah. So that's why we're working too. That's why we have the three-pronged approach, because it's not enough to just try to wake up these people. It's you got to be able to provide them with support, I think. And so we do have an awesome support group. I mean, there are a lot of people on the internet talking about parental alienation, a whole bunch of groups, and I see a lot of toxicity. I hate to say it, but
Mm.
I do see a lot of fighting, infighting, toxicity, a lot of traumatized people, I understand, and a lot of really hurt people. But in our group, it really doesn't seem to have that same dynamic. It's people who just want support, and we have an awesome friend of mine who vets everybody.
Hmm.
Um, unless I had somebody that I know personally. And she does an excellent job of vetting them, and she has really in-depth conversations with them. And most people who figure it out have given me really good feedback about the group. And we are actually planning this year the first ever therapeutic retreat slash convention for former alienated children.
Wow, that
We, yes,
let me know when that's happening because I may show
please
up.
come.
I may
Please come.
I may
We
show up to
all,
that because I could
yeah,
sure use the help myself. Even though I will be honest with you, I'm for the most part healed as much as you can heal from that.
yeah.
But yeah, I know I'm in that group. I'm pretty quiet. I'm like a lurker, but trust me, I'm in there every day. But it's
Well, Dan, the thing is, though, you would bring immense value because so many people, when they first figure it out, are somewhat hopeless. So to see somebody who has reached such a level of healing and has been able to create a great life for themselves despite the fact that they were alienated would give so much hope and insight to people who really need it. So
well,
you would be, I please come. I'll let you know. We're also
yep.
going to try to fundraise so that people who can't, young people specifically, probably who can't afford to come, might still have the opportunity to come.
Yeah, a question, and I of course will do all of that you've asked. I'm more than happy to because I have my certain issues that I really want to focus on. Domestic violence against men is one. I ran a domestic violence survivors group, all that, and this is right there with them. So I absolutely will contribute. I do have a question that I want to get out before I forget to ask it, which is how have the colleges responded to it? Because, like you said, the students don't know what it is, and then they figure it out. But college campuses, there's some good, there's some bad. We all know what's going on at colleges right now. How have the administrators, I guess, responded to you inquiring about showing up and talking?
Well, I'm not really sure they have much room to talk because as long as we connect with a student organization and get connected with them, then we're able to do what's called tabling, where we bring big tables out into the area near the student union on the
Mm-hmm.
campus. And we have a big banner that says, "It is legal to steal a child. Change my mind." It
Wow.
is it is legal to possibly steal a child. Change my mind. Yeah, we wanted it to be provocative. Um, as long as we're connected to a student on campus or a student organization, we have the freedom of speech. So it's not really a worry of mine or a concern of mine about what the university specifically thinks, because as long as you are connected to the university in some way or the student organization, then you have the right to share your opinions.
Yeah, it's interesting because, and the reason I asked the question, Maddie, was because, and it's been 20 years. We tried to do something. I called it an outreach program back then, where we would talk to college kids, specifically boys. I shouldn't call them boys, men in college, about domestic violence, and the resistance we got to it was unbelievable. To the point they wouldn't allow us on the campus.
Wow.
Yeah, they no, we're not going there. We're not, we're not no. And now we didn't try to do the what would you call it tabling. I was trying to go in and like do a forum type thing. And this was in the Albany, New York area, and I reached out even to the college I went to, and zero acceptance.
Wow.
So
I wonder
again,
what would happen if you did that today.
I'm curious. You got me thinking. That's why I'm like, because I would have thought there would have been some not the resistance to the level that we dealt with, but I would have thought there would have been some resistance. But it sounds like there's been none.
I don't think so. I think it's mostly these people online who are so concerned with either let's get rid of the term or it only happens to women, yada, yada, yada. Like even the students we talked to who didn't have a personal experience with parental alienation, when we asked them, we turned the question around on them and said, how do you think it might be possible to legally steal a child? All of them would say something like, maybe during a divorce or a custody dispute. So people have seen this. They know what it is. They just don't know what it's called. And they don't really understand how damaging it is or how widespread it is.
How widespread do you think it is? Because you mentioned the 20% number earlier. I'm genuinely curious where you would put the number at. I mean, it's not a hard number you can come up with at this point. There's not enough research has been done. But where do you think it is?
Well, I know the researchers say that 22 million targeted parents are in the US alone. If each of will be to be very conservative, if you do the math, if there are 22 million targeted parents and they all only have one child, obviously that is 22 million alienated children, which is I think it's a higher amount. I read that it's like a higher amount than the amount of kids that have autism.
Oh, it's got to be.
It's it's a very, very widespread problem. I think you also see now people talking about the sorry, let me start over. You also see people talking now about the estrangement epidemic.
Yes.
And I know a lot of those estranged kids are alienated because I thought I was estranged for 20 years. I wasn't. I was alienated. So a lot of these conversations are really important to have.
They are because the bottom line with your organization and you and all the work you're doing is you're trying to help these people. You know, the
Mhm.
naysayers, the ones that come back at you and me, it doesn't exist. Really? You're going to tell me my experiences aren't valid? I have no problem slamming them. I am pretty blunt about it. Like, really? You're going to tell me that nothing that happened to me ever happened, right? And sometimes I've shut them
Feels
up with it.
familiar, right?
Yeah.
Feels
I
familiar.
mean, I have actually said, you do realize you're displaying the behavior that is alienation, and then they get really mad at me. But anyway, but the bottom line is you're trying to help people. These people that are coming back with the negative responses, in my opinion, the majority of the time, they are alienators.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah. Someone recently told me that like in these targeted parent groups, they've like been finding that like about 20% of people who claim to be targeted parents are actually alienators.
oh, I
And
completely agree with that.
I agree with that. I've been fooled by a lot of people who are actually alienators. And I know that like the delusional type of alienator, it's a victimhood mentality with everything in their life. And I mean, I've even heard that my mom has claimed that my dad is alienating me from her
Well,
now.
that's a response that's very common, right? Is when it
Yeah.
gets found. My mother tried the same thing. Oh yeah, you see, you're I forget the wording, but I'll paraphrase. But your dad's turning you against me.
Yeah.
No, you turned me against you, and I
Yeah. No, yeah, no, dad won't talk bad about you, even though he has every right to.
yeah, my dad never talked about it either. We talked about that earlier. And that's where I would hope that someone that was an alienator, and I want to get your opinion on this. I hope that maybe when they see if they were to watch something like this, they might realize that one that they had the behavior, and two the toxicity of it and how much it's affected, and maybe try and change. I have never seen an alienator be able to change, ever. I have you. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
No, no, I haven't. I found a paper uh during the time that I was had figured everything out, and it was like a back and front a lined of lined paper, and my mom had written out in her own handwriting like all the different things I've done to hurt my dad, as if she was trying to convince herself that it was all my decision.
Oh, that wouldn't surprise me at all that she was doing that.
Like left his wedding early, wouldn't go with him at age 9, like that she is still convinced herself it was all my decision. But I remember I have evidence that she knows, or I have evidence that she knew what she was doing, because she would always ask me or say, I'm not, this isn't going to, you're not going to blame me when you're older, right? Like I'm afraid that you're going to blame me when you're older for your relationship with your dad. And I would always assure her, of course not, Mom. This is all my decision. Like, I'm not going to blame you for anything.
Now, see, I was the exact opposite, and so was my sister. We disowned our mother.
Well, I've done that now.
Yeah, I mean, to the point when she died in 2016, my sister and I held a party. Us, just the two of us. We literally
Yeah.
cheered. I mean, how
I mean, that.
I don't even feel guilty about it, Maddie. That's the worst part, is that I feel guilty that I don't feel guilty, because I cannot forgive her for what she did. It's I having done the research, having learned how alienators think, I know she knew what she was doing.
The intelligent ones, there's a difference too between the ones who are intelligent. My mom graduated top of her class at undergrad and in dental school, like very, very smart. But they will play dumb. I don't know. I like to think that I forgive her for me because I don't want to feel angry at her forever. I really don't. I think I have like what they call a trauma bond,
Mm-hmm.
because I can still like think of her face and want her to love me,
Mm-hmm.
but also feel haunted by by everything she did.
I honestly hope that you can forgive her in some way. I do, because you know, dealing with it the way I did, like I said, I have no guilt at disowning her, none whatsoever. But I don't say that it's a good thing for me or my sister, right, or my children, right. They did have their grandmother in their life for a period of time. But it reached a point where she was trying to alienate me from my then wife. I mean, alienators are alienators. They're always going to do it. And the minute she did that behavior, the first
Yes.
time, it was over. And I told her,
Oh my
"You're done.
gosh.
You are done."
Dan, the same thing happened to me. She tried to get my husband to divorce me, and that was the final straw. I was like, this is never going to end. I can't believe you would do that.
Hmm. And that's when I reached that point and cut her off. And she spent the last 15 years of her life alone. Literally, the whole family turned their back on her. She died alone. I don't say that with any pride. I say it in a way as a caution to an alienating parent, is that
Sure.
if you realize you're doing that behavior, or you might have in the past, acknowledge it, get whatever help you need, therapy, whatever, and go to your kids and apologize, and do
Yes.
try and heal, because it benefits no one to get to the point that my sister and I did with our mother. It's certainly not a benefit to me, even though it may sound like it, because I mean, we literally cheered. I mean, that's sad. You know,
That's sad.
it is sad. I don't want that for anyone. I hope you can have some sort of bond with your mother, because,
No, no,
but
that fills
yeah,
me with terror.
yeah,
Fills me with dread and terror. I think it's possible to forgive someone and still know that it's not safe to have them in your life. But the irony of it all, I think, is that most of this pathological alienating behavior comes from a place of extreme fear and insecurity. At least in my case, I could say I know my mom was afraid that I would prefer my dad over her, afraid I'd want to live with him or spend more time with him, afraid of losing me, afraid of being alone. But that fear of hers ended up having her essentially put me in a little box my whole life and trap me and isolate me from everyone, including my siblings, including my extended family, including my friends. And there comes a time where you reach a breaking point and you burst out of that box, and you never want to see that person who entrapped you again. And that's what I did. I moved across the country to get away from her.
you made a really good point there, which is they I agree with you. It comes from a place of fear of losing the child, or however you want to phrase it, but it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes,
You know,
it happened. They make it happen in
they
the
make it
end.
happen. Exactly right. And again, that doesn't benefit anyone. I genuinely feel for you and what you're going through, and but I understand it. Someone who has never been through it can't probably fathom it, right? And that's where us speaking out and sharing our stories, and letting our feelings be known, that what we dealt with and are dealing with. Because I had people say to me, why don't you want your children to have access to your grandmother or your mother?
Yeah.
And I'm like, you have no idea. I will never allow that to happen. Now, they did have relationships, when they became adults, not all of them, but a couple of them reconnected with her. I have no problem with that, but they also knew what was going on, what had happened to me, right? So, it's it's a difficult situation for everyone. So if you're listening to this and you're going, "Geez, am I an alienator?" Look into it and get help,
Yeah,
because
and
it's. Go ahead.
if you're listening to this, I was just going to add, if you're listening to this as someone who thinks that you might be an alienated child or you've been through this from that point of view, please look up my project, the Anti-Alienation Project. We have a support group on Facebook, and we have two Zoom calls twice a month, and we have a licensed therapist in Florida who works with alienated kids and their families who volunteers their time to help lead our support group. So it's really important to get that support. I can't stress that enough. You don't need to go through this alone. Talking to other people who've been through severe alienation, I've realized that if you take a child and put them through severe parental alienation, what will happen in their life are a series of very, very predictable effects and results. And by the end of it, you kind of feel like a shell of yourself and you've been made to feel crazy. It really is narcissistic abuse on a child. And you don't need to do this alone. There's power in numbers. I promise you might find some nugget of support or truth or help if you reach out. I would be happy to talk to you, and you're not alone.
How can they follow you, Maddie, or reach out to you? What are the various ways they can do so?
Okay, so
Pressure's on now. You got to remember them all.
Our big launch date for our website and the college campaigns that we're going to be fundraising for, so hopefully we can continue doing them, will be January 25th. So the website is, I don't know when you'll have this video up, but hopefully,
It will be
yeah.
right before that. If my target date to release it is the 21st, so feel
Okay.
free, go for it.
So in 4 days after watching this, you could look up the anti-alienationproject.com. But I'm on most social platforms, and I do share different things on different platforms. But I'm most active on YouTube, so the Anti-Alienation Project on YouTube. I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok to get through to the younger generation. Um, and then the email, if you want to reach out to me via email, if you want to get in touch, email is usually the best way. I don't always check Twitter or Instagram messages. So our email is the anti-alienation project at gmail.com.
And I encourage everyone to go follow Maddie and the organization because, like I said, I had followers from the first video you put out
That's
reach out to
wild.
me and say, "You have got to go see what this girl," they were calling you, no offense intended, is saying, because it was resonating with them. And they also knew I had talked about parental alienation a few times because I've had accounts banned, and I actually talked about it more on my prior accounts than I do now, and I need to get back to more of it. But they were reaching out to me going, "Oh my God," and saying things like we've talked about, which is I just realized that maybe I was alienated, or my ex is alienating me. And again, I
Yeah.
want to stress it's not a gender issue per se. I do think dads are alienated more than moms, but it shouldn't happen to anyone. And I don't like making it a gendered issue as much as I.
No, I don't even like that you have to say that
Yeah, but you
constantly.
kind of have
Because
to, it's
people are going to give you so much crap.
right.
That's the thing. People can't just focus. I think people need to focus on the child.
Thank you.
It needs to be on the child. Like, forget if it's a gendered issue. Forget if we should call it something else. Like, let's just focus on helping these kids and how we can do that.
And that I'm going to close it out on that because that was the perfect way to do it. But I do want to give you one final opportunity. Is there anything else you do want to add?
Hmm. Oh, we have a newsletter, so maybe I could send you the link for that, Dan, to put
I,
out a newsletter to stay in touch. But yeah, so hopefully we're going to be doing our next college campaign in California in February. And then I think we have for our short list Colorado and Ohio, possibly Florida, but please reach out to me. We're
I will.
offering parents the opportunity to sponsor a university if they'd like, or we have some other things too. We're going to roll out later in February, other ways to get through to alienated children. We're trying to be a third-party service
Mhm.
to wake up other alienated children. I've been just, whenever I go to the gym, I'm like at the treadmill, either writing my videos out or I'm just imagining myself in college and what a banner would have needed to say to tip me off and make me Google the Anti-Alienation Project.com. So we've come up with different phrases, images, ways to try to get through to those kids. So stay tuned because we're going to have a lot more initiatives coming out.
That's awesome, Maddie. And I will put links to everything in the show
Thank
description
you.
and notes. So all of your websites, all your TikToks and YouTubes and all those things, because
Too many things.
it's a lot to remember. So if you're looking, and I really want anyone that's listening to this, especially if you've listened this far, go follow Maddie and support the organization. And I'm going to encourage you, because you're a North Carolina girl and I live in North Carolina, that we get together on the college campus here. I will be right there with you. And let's help raise awareness. And I want to have you back on down the road so that you can give us updates on what's going on and further discussions, because the more we talk about this issue, the better it is for everyone. So I want to thank
Yes,
you.
yes, and yes. Yes, I want to thank you too. Thank you so much. And I would love to have you on my project as well. I'll share the work that you've done because
I've already said yes. So,
yes, so we need to do that.
all right.
Really appreciate your time and being invited to be on your podcast. Thank you.
You're welcome, Maddie. And I truly appreciate you. And I want you to consider yourself an expert, because you are, and you have touched lives. You're a young lady. You have already changed lives, and that's something you should be damn proud of, because I can tell you, you've affected me. And if you've affected me at my old age, in a good way, that says something, because not much affects me anymore. So kudos to you for
Oh,
everything you do. I personally appreciate everything you do, and I thank you for doing it. And I know that the best is yet to come. So thank you again for coming on.
thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate
All
it.
right, I'm going to go ahead and close things down. Guys, if you've watched this far, you got to do me a favor. Give me that thumbs up. Matter of fact, give me 2 of them. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. The podcast comes out every Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern. And you can go on YouTube. It's on Spotify. It's on Apple. It's on Rumble. It's on other places I can't remember off the top of my head right now. Don't forget, I'm up on TikTok myself. On Twitter, where I can say things I can't say here or anywhere else, and I do. So, follow me on those social medias. And like I said, I'll put all of Maddie's information in the show notes. I truly appreciate you for joining us for the conversation between Maddie and I hope you learned something from it. And if you've been through parental alienation, know that there is support out there through Maddie's group. If you want to reach out to me, and understand that you are not alone. As we talked about during the show, it's a much bigger problem than most people realize. And I do think that a lot of what we see in society's ills are in some way related to parental alienation, whether it's drugs, alcoholism, and all that. In many cases, that's the reason why. So I will see you next time. Don't forget, give me that like, and have a great week. We'll see you next week on Men Need to Be Heard.